Okay, all right, friends. So this is called the Call to the Beloved Community. This was written for you. Actually, it was augmented from a talk that I gave to another community toward the end of last year, but now it's been updated specifically for this time and context, and also for your time and context. So what we're going to do is we're going to really focus down on race, but the thing that we really need to do is we need to ask the question, what are the ways that we confuse what race is? Because it's that confusion that I think is a large part of keeping us from attaining this thing we call the beloved community. So we're going to start with an understanding, trying to get an understanding of ethnicity. Then we're going to move to culture, then nationality. Then we'll finally be like park on race for the rest of the time. Ethnicity is dynamic. Ethnicity is created as people groups move through time and space together and are shaped by common experiences on that land. Ethnicity is the difference between African American and Jamaican. Ethnicity is the difference between Nigerian and Brit, Afro Brit. There's Breton. There's as people groups move across land and encounter common experiences, they are shaped by those experiences. They get the same issues. They get the same strengths. They get a very similar worldview because they have all experienced the same thing of this world. It's also the difference between the Irish in Ireland and Irish Americans. Very, very different because they've had different, they have a divergent experience. When the Irish Americans came to America, they had a whole other experience that the Irish never had. My mom and dad visited Ireland back in I think it was 2000. They visited Ireland for the first time, and they were walking down the street, I believe in Dublin, and some people kept stopping them and saying, "How are you today?" You know, I can't do the accent, but it's like I have to do a Lucky Charms accent to get there. But how are you today? You know, can we help you with anything? And then wherever they looked, they saw Mary J. Blige everywhere. Like they love Mary J. Blige in Ireland. That would not be my mom and dad's experience in South Boston, would it? It wouldn't be my mom and dad's experience in an Irish American enclave in America. Why? Because of the Irish Americans' experience in America, particularly their experience being pushed to fight the Civil War. And to become chattel. They were pushed to the front. They were made chattel. They were not experienced as white when they first got here. For the first maybe 100 years of being here, they were not seen as white. And they were pushed into the ghettos of New York City and Boston. And they felt threatened by people of African descent who were fleeing north during the Great Migration. And so their interaction, their worldview, their view of people of African descent is extremely different from those in the nation of Ireland, whose primary experience of the world has been one who's been oppressed mostly by England and the UK. And so that's the difference between race and ethnicity. Culture, what is culture? Now, if ethnicity is dynamic, culture is fluid. So it's a sociological and an anthropological term. It's not in the Bible. You don't see culture, that word used in the Bible, but it's intimated in the Bible. It's implied in the Bible. It refers to beliefs, norms, rituals, arts, and worldviews of particular people in particular space at particular time. And it's created by their lived environment. So the difference in culture is the difference between an African American who lives in New York City and an African American who lives in Colorado Springs. Two different cultures. Some things are similar because of the ethnic experience in the nation of oppression and the historical roots in the South. But there are going to be a lot of things that are very different simply because you have different materials to build with in Denver or in Colorado Springs, in the mountains, than you do in New York City. You have different things to eat. So your foods are going to be different. Cultures create their music out of the artifacts, the lived environment around them. So if you have a sea culture, you're going to have a lot of music that has the sounds of the sea. using conch shells and other things. If you live in the desert, your sounds are going to be very different. So culture is created by the lived environment, and it is fluid. There is no one white culture. There is no one Black culture. It is fluid. Nationality. Nationality is really very simple. It is what nation issued you your passport. If you have dual citizenship, usually you might have two passports. It's what nations claim you as their citizen. That's your nationality. Now let's get to race. Race is about one thing. It's about power. One thing. And we talked about that last night. Race was created in order to discern who has the right and the call to exercise dominion on land. In fact, if we'll go back just quickly to Plato's The Republic, which we reviewed last night. In Plato's Republic, he says that race is the different metals that people are made of. Well, we know that people are not made of metal, but there was no science back then, so we'll go with it for a minute. And what he says is that some people are made of gold, others are made of silver, others are made of copper, and whatever their metal is determines how they will serve society. And then Aristotle, just 10 years later, created hierarchy. He was Plato's student, and he said, there's this thing called Western supremacy. And so he said that the only full humans are those from the West, those who speak like us, who look like us, who build like us. And of course, now, there was no thought to the reality that, well, you build like you build because you have a lot of stones around you, so you use stone. Some people don't have a lot of stones, so they don't use stone. They use wood, or they use adobe, they use brick. But in his mind, and ultimately the philosophy that was passed down through most of Western civilization, all of Western civilization, is that to be human meant to be white, to be male, and to be able-bodied, able to walk on two legs. Papal bull, this was Pope Nicholas V of Papal bull of 1454, 52, 56, depending on who you're reading. And that actually indoctrinated, it gave us the doctrine of discovery. And what he did was he declared, this is again by way of review, he declared to an explorer who came to him, who's actually a friend of his family, who said, hey, Pope, I need a blessing because I'm going to go exploring. And he said, I'll give you a blessing. You can claim land that is not civilized wherever you go, claim it for the throne, and you can enslave their people. So from these three, what you see here philosophy and now religion are entrenching the hierarchies of human belonging. Now I want to introduce to you a new figure, Elizabeth Key. Elizabeth Key was born in around 1630. In 1656, she started to think for a minute. She said, wait a minute, my dad is a British citizen. And as a British citizen, the common law of Britain says that you cannot enslave another British citizen. And it passes down the question of citizenship through the line of the father. Now remember, she lived in Virginia, just across the river from Jamestown. And at that time, this was in English, a British colony. So it was British law that reigned. And according to British law, she should not have been enslaved. Not only was her father a British citizen, so therefore she's a British citizen, but her father recognized her as his daughter and had her baptized. So she said, I shouldn't be able to be enslaved. Her father was, by the way, also enslaving her. So she took her case to court and won. So Elizabeth Key, she caused a ruckus basically, because a lot of other enslaved people began to get hip to this. Remember, slavery is pretty young at this point. Slavery began in 1619. And at that time, it wasn't race-based slavery. It was indentured servitude. But a lot of times, sometimes the people were enslaved and most times they were indentured. And that meant they had an expiration date. But over the years, people of African descent were treated differently in indentured servitude. The records would just mysteriously disappear. So people didn't really know when their indenture began, so they ended up serving for most of their lives. Or they served for longer than they should have served. Elizabeth was actually enslaved. And so when she went to court and she won, other enslaved people in the Virginia colony began to say, wait a minute, I shouldn't be enslaved either. My dad, my father is also a British citizen, and I've been baptized. Native American people who were enslaved, other Black people, other people of African descent who were enslaved, all took their cases to court, and they won. So in 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the governing body at the time, changed the status of citizenship, where it comes from. They said, no longer are we going to live according to the English common law, even though they were a British colony. Now we're going to live according to Roman law, the Roman law of partus, which traces the lineage of the citizenship lineage of the child through the line of the mother, not the father. So from that point forward in 1662, you actually have enslavement in perpetuity, because what they say is, if your mother is enslaved, she's not a citizen. And if your mother is not a citizen, then you are not a citizen. Nor, and they add this, which is really this is the line that created race-based slavery in America. Nor shall your descendants be in perpetuity. So from that point forward, slavery becomes race-based. It becomes Black slavery. And pretty soon after that, Native American slavery is phased out. And actually 8 years later, innovations in technology made it possible for Britain to make the trek from Africa on slave ships directly to the colony of Virginia, not stopping in the Caribbean first, which then torqued up the transatlantic slave trade. And very, very soon after that, Maryland and Virginia had more people of African descent than white people in their colonies. And then at that point, that's when the race laws start to clamp down, and the lines between Black and white, the definitions between Black and white become stark and stark and stark until you get till like the early 1700s to mid 1700s. That's when you get the police patrols, 1705. That's when you get not police, they called them slave patrols, which is the beginnings of the police in America. Okay, so you go from here, you go just 100 years later, and that's where you get Carl Linnaeus, who we talked about last night, the botanist who actually then, through science now, entrenches human hierarchy. And then you get the Three-Fifths Compromise, when we are a new nation. We've done the Revolutionary War. We're in the very first Congress in 1787. And that first Congress embeds in the Constitution that people of African descent are not only not citizens, but they're less than a human being. And like we said last night, the first census doesn't even have Black people on it. The only race on that on the first census is white. And here is, I wanted to show you the Naturalization Act of 1790, where it says that the only people who can, now this is interesting, it's about citizenship again, remember? The only people who can become a citizen in the United States are free white people. And what they really meant here was men and their property, which included their wives and their children. So here you have the struggle. This is the struggle that we have been in from the very, very beginning. And we get to the 14th Amendment after the Civil War. And the 14th Amendment is passed, and for the very first time in American history, you have the establishment of citizenship that is not by race, and actually says, if you are born here, if you take your first breath on this soil, then you are a citizen. And it embeds it in the Constitution. And so, friends, from that point forward, this is our struggle. This is our struggle. The question of citizenship is the struggle at the foundation of our nation. It is the question of who is created to rule and who is created to be ruled. That's the question, the fundamental, central question of our nation. It's the question behind the Cherokee Trail of Tears and the removal of all of the Native American peoples from their lands. It's the question of whether or not we would free human beings from slaveocracy. It's the question of the struggle against Jim Crow and redlining, and the struggle for job equity and a living wage. It's the struggle against the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's what the Chinese Exclusion Act was struggling to attain, which was literally white supremacy on this soil. It's the struggle that women engaged in the women's suffrage movement. It is the struggle of the Japanese internment camps and the Bracero program. And it is the symbolic struggle, the symbolic annihilation of LA's 1943 Zoot Suit riots, where Mexican American men had adopted like this style called the Zoot Suit. And it just exuded dignity. And when sailors got off the ships in Long Beach and came in to the LA port, LA downtown area, they didn't like seeing people who were not white with dignity. And so they literally took clubs to them. They beat like Chicano men to death. And the police stood back. The police said, literally, this is a quote. They said they didn't want to, quote, pick on kids in the service. And then they rounded up the victims and jailed them. This is the struggle of Bloody Sunday on Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. This is the struggle of the civil rights movement. This is the struggle for the vote. It is all about citizenship. This is the struggle of the LGBTQIA+ movement. It is a fight for the 14th Amendment to be fully realized. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection of the law for every citizen. It is the fight of environmental justice, the fight against toxic agents being dumped into your land simply because they can, because you have less political power, because you have fewer numbers. It is the fight for disability rights, the ability and the right for all people, even those who can't walk on two legs, to flourish in this land. And it all comes from the same source, the same sources within Western civilization. Right now, we are in a time of reckoning. We are in a time where our underlying beliefs about the world, about ourselves, about how God relates to us and to others is being revealed. Today, people of European descent make up 59.7% of the US population. Demographers widely project that by 2045, within 25 years, the white population, people of European descent within the United States, will drop below 50%. Demographer Dudley L. Preston wrote in January 2020 report, this is a quote from him, on the first day of 2020, whites under age 18 were already in the minority. Among all of the young people now in the United States, there are more minority young people than there are young white people. Now, of course, they're not a minority then. We should change that language. There are more people of color who are in the majority in the United States than there are white people among the young people. So Robert P. Jones, author of White Too Long, explains that the perceived external threat of racial and cultural change primed white Christians for receptivity to Donald Trump. Now, I know this is a church thing. We don't want to get too political or too partisan. So I'm not being partisan here. I'm being real. I'm being truthful. We have to talk about the actual world we live in. And this is what he says. He says that white Christians were primed for a white supremacist politics, if you will. He says, in the course of a single political campaign, Donald Trump converted white evangelical values voters into nostalgia voters. And lest you think that it's only white evangelicals that long for the good old days when white men ruled. In a study conducted by Jones, his organization, PRRI, Public Religion Research Institute, they asked 2,500 adults living in all 50 states, do you long for the 1950s? The majority of all white Americans across the board said yes, while the vast majorities of people of color said no. Why? Because Emmett Till was the 1950s. Redlining for people of color and white people benefiting from the GI Bill was the 1950s. 1950s was before the Civil Rights Act, before the Voting Rights Act. The Civil Rights Act enforced the 14th Amendment. The Voting Rights Act enforced the 15th Amendment. The 50s was before we had that enforcement. The 1950s, 59% of people of African descent were living under the poverty line. In the 1950s, this was before Stonewall launched the LGBTQIA movement. 1950s was before, 4 decades before the Americans with Disabilities Act. So no, we don't long for the 1950s. I had a really profound moment not too long ago. I was thinking back, I was trying to remember, go back to a time when people of European descent, I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment and then we'll go back to it. But I was trying to remember a time when people of European descent did not assume that wherever they went in the world, they should lead. And the key word here is should. That they did not attempt to dominate the other where they went. And I was thinking about that. So think with me. Can you think back to a time, an era, when that was not the case? I'm going to give you a second. When was that time? I tell you, I drew a blank. I really did. I drew a blank. When was that time? Okay, so then I remembered. It's like a little light bulb went off and I'm going to share my screen again. So then a light bulb went off and I remembered you have to go back to the Greek Empire, before the Greek Empire, in order to get to the time when people of European descent did not, wherever they went in the world, imagine that they were meant to live there, to not live, but rule there. That's nearly 3,000 years ago, y'all. 3,000 years of imagining yourself as the one that was created to rule all. 3,000 years. But we are coming into an era where people of color already actually make up the majority of people in the world. And now, for the very first time in human history, people of European descent will not be the majority, nor the presumed leaders in the most powerful nation on earth, the United States of America. There was a time when people of European descent weren't, but you have to go back 3,000 years, right? To Babylon or to Egypt, but not since then. So friends, we have a choice. We have a choice that we must make. We can war for supremacy in boardrooms and churches and businesses and schools and in voting booths, or we can lean into the beloved community. This is a print of a painting by John August Swanson. Psalm 85 is what it's called, 10 through 11. In Psalm 85, 10 through 11, it reads, steadfast love and faithfulness will meet. Righteousness and peace will kiss each other. Faithfulness will spring up from the ground, and righteousness will look down from the sky. You see it there. In fact, if you look closely, you can see the scriptures actually written into the text, written into the lines of the sun rays and also of the grass, the tree roots. It's really beautiful. When you parse that language, the Hebrew, the word love there means kindness, steadfast kindness. The word faithfulness there means trustworthiness. It's not just that you're full of faith in God. In fact, it doesn't mean that. That's not what the writers were talking about. It's that you are trustworthy. Kindness and trustworthiness will meet. Righteousness, that word righteousness, what do you think it means? Normally people think of righteousness and they think holy, they think pure, but that's not what this means. When you translate this from the text, it means just. It means equitable, equity, fairness. So righteousness means equity, and peace here is the actual word shalom, which is that word that we learn in the very beginning, that very first chapter of the book of Genesis, not because the word is used, because it's not, but because the picture of it is drawn so beautifully. It is that radical connection of all things, which you see in this picture. It is the radical wellness of all of the relationships in creation that we talked about last night. So equity and the radical wellness of all things will kiss each other. Faithfulness, truth-telling, trustworthiness, the actual word is truth-telling, or another way to put it is truth-telling. Well, truth-telling will spring up from the earth. Truth is going to spring from the earth. And righteousness, justice, or equity will look down from the sky. This, what you see right here, this is a picture of the beloved community. Dr. King put it another way when he talked about the beloved community. Dr. King said, the beloved community is a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. The beloved community is the way of us thinking of the way that we begin to live into that and the decisions that we make about how we live together. And that is our politics, people. It's not our partisanship. You can be a part of any party and still call for the beloved community. There is no intrinsic call for any party to be the party of the beloved community. The beloved community does not find its roots in any party. The beloved community finds its roots in your faith, in God, in Jesus, in the vision of shalom. And so, as people who are God followers, whatever party we are a part of, we must call that party to be a party of shalom, a party that builds the beloved community, because that is the vision of our God. Dr. King goes on to say, in the beloved community, racism, we would now call this white supremacy, white nationalism, and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. It's a direct quote from the King Center. So friends, this Psalm 85 is our vision. It is our call. The beloved community is our call. We have the power right now to war with God for supremacy, or to lean into the call for beloved community. That is our choice. This is our call. Amen. You're muted, Claire.
Oh,
There you go.
thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for the help, friend. Hi, Lisa.
Hi there.
Thank you for helping me out just a minute ago. Thank you for your time and a wonderful presentation you just offered us. It's not just spiritually nourishing, but a rich invitation for each of us to examine how we can work towards building the beloved community. One of the things that strikes me most, not only about what you offered up last night and again this morning, but also in your wonderful book, The Very Good Gospel, is the vision, the journey, the cultivation towards shalom and beloved community, is that it's going to take all of us.
Yes.
It will take all of us to embrace the image of God in each other to create communities in which God intended. So rather than ask you questions that I created myself, I sought questions from individuals of all ages, races, genders, and differing beliefs to send me their questions about racism, the history of racism, and working towards the beloved community. Our first question comes from Christian, age 16, a resident of Kansas, and he asks, if we could tackle only one part of institutional racism today, where would you suggest we start and why?
Wow, that's a really great question. Christian is his name?
Mm-hmm.
What a great name. I actually have been thinking a lot about this, and we actually are facing this very question right now in Congress. Congress is struggling right now to figure out whether or not they should try to first end the filibuster or first try to pass voting rights. It is between those two things. Why? Because the filibuster, it sounds so technical, but the filibuster is a technical tool created in Congress in order to obstruct a majority party from being able to pass its legislation. It started in 1805 and was quickly in 1806 kind of disbanded. They said, oh, we don't want to use that, never mind. It's been taken up at various times, usually in that struggle to determine who is a citizen, who has equal protection of the law. The last time that in the modern day, the time it was really brought up and actually then instituted was in 1967, when the ratification of the Civil Rights Act was trying to be passed. And Southern legislators, lawmakers, filibustered. They filibustered trying to block passage of the Civil Rights Act, which enforces the 14th Amendment, y'all, the question of citizenship. So if we want to move forward, there's nothing that I think the most strategic thing to do would actually be to end the filibuster. Because if you end the filibuster, then you have the ability then to pass on a simple majority, not needing 60 votes in Congress, and also not allowing the system to be gummed up. Now, the cool thing about that is that, you know, the majority is not always going to be Democratic. Sometimes it'll be Republican, and everybody then benefits from that. But what you do is you create an actual political system, not political warfare, which is where we are right now. We're no longer doing politics in America. We are in the middle of political warfare. And in warfare is a zero-sum game, and casualties are expected. And white people of European descent, are right now a casualty of political warfare that's being waged in our nation. You can see the COVID numbers, 500,000 dead, the vast majority of which are people of European descent. Why? Because people have been, through politics, enacting this hierarchy of human belonging, calling on people of color to go back to work without protection, and then saying you are essential workers, but you're not essential enough for us to give you a protection, or hazard pay. So these are the things that that the filibuster could actually help us. When you end that filibuster, you then basically clear the way for all of the things, all of the losses that we lost in the last 4 years. We lost the civil rights, we lost the Voting Rights Act because of the Supreme Court's ruling that one of the sections was unconstitutional because they said there was no longer a need for it, which of course now we can see there's absolutely a need for it. Right now we have 143 bills that are being tried to pass through Congress or through their state legislators, trying to suppress votes in 43 states. And so we need the Voting Rights Act, but it's been hobbled, and that's why we have that onslaught of changes. So if you end the filibuster, then you also can pass the new Voting Rights Act, which does exactly what the Supreme Court told them they need to do. It fixed it. It fixed the Voting Rights Act and made it actually so that it updated the measure that would be needed in order to call states to account for their voting laws. So I guess I fall on the side of ending the filibuster because I think that's the most strategic thing we could do. And from there, then you could do any number of different pieces of legislation that bring justice and equity.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
As many of us strive to become more anti-racist and address our implicit bias, so we can dismantle that institutional racism, are there spiritual or meditative practices that you suggest young people engage in when they're striving to authentically and sacredly see the other, to see no stranger, to see the image of God in another human being?
Yes. Last night we did a practice at the end of our time, and I guess I don't want to take up too much time with that practice right now, but I'll describe it for those who were not here. I have literally learned to catch myself. Unconscious bias is unconscious. That's the whole point of it, right? It's not conscious. It lives below the surface, but we still operate it according to it. Like we still make our decisions. We make our decisions about where we're going to live according to our unconscious biases, and sometimes our conscious biases. We make decisions about where our children will go to school according to our biases, our unconscious biases. We make decisions about where we're going to shop, about who we're going to buy from, all according to unconscious and conscious biases. So when unconscious biases come from beneath the surface and become manifest, that's the moment when we have the opportunity to, as a spiritual practice, do what Paul said to do: take every thought captive. He said to do this in Romans. Well, we got to do it. Take every thought captive. And actually, the science now bears this out. The scientists, who are the people who are studying implicit bias, unconscious bias, they have shown that if you can leverage those moments when your biases become conscious and speak to them, speak the truth to them. So when I'm driving in an Uber and my Uber driver, my taxi driver is Ethiopian, and I imagine in my head, without unconsciously, he's supposed to be my Uber driver. Of course, my Uber driver or my taxi driver is Ethiopian, because that's what they were created to do. They were created to drive me. Or when in Los Angeles, when you're driving through a neighborhood and you see Mexican workers in the front yards, and you see Latinas who are actually the nannies and the housekeepers, or your housekeeper, you imagine, well, that's, of course, because that's what they were created to do. Or when you're in Kansas and you're driving through the fields and you see Mexican workers, migrant workers out there, you don't question it because that's just the way things are. But it's not just the way things are. It's the way we've made them. It's the way we made them. So I've started to ask my Uber drivers or the nanny or the people who I encounter where my own bias, when it comes to the surface, I've started to break that bias by asking them questions. So what is your background? Where were you born in America? If you were not born in America, where were you born? What brought you here? And then the critical question is, what did you do back in your homeland? What was your vocation back in your homeland? And do you know that literally to a person, usually what they will say, an Ethiopian driving my car, he will say, I was a doctor. Mm-hmm. He will say, I was an engineer. She will say, I own several businesses. But here, they have been, like Plato told us to do, they have been said, okay, you are Mexican, this is how you will serve society. You are Ethiopian, therefore you will be my driver. You see that? Mm-hmm. So we humanize the other by hearing their story, by listening, by asking questions and not assuming we know, and by taking those thoughts captive when they come and speaking truth to them. And then the last piece, and I'll close this question, this response with this. The last thing that I do is that exercise we did last night. If I can see their eyes, I look at their eyes. And then I try to look beyond their eyes, on the other side of their eyes. I look for the image of God in them. And I understand that when I find it, that image of God is not just saying all God's children, got shoes, or all God loves all God's children, red, yellow, black, and white. It's not about that. Mm-hmm. It's saying the meaning behind it is, when I see that image of God, what I am looking at is the divine call of God to exercise dominion in the world, including on this land. And that's the corrective. That's the corrective to the human hierarchy that lives inside of me unconsciously.
Beautifully said. These two questions, they're kind of part A, part B, also come from youth. Talk about the history of racism. So Isabella, age 14, resident of Kansas, asks, with the history of racism in the South being as strong as it is, would you say racism is still most prevalent there within the boundaries of the United States? And Matt, age 14, has a follow-up to that and says, would you say that racism is more prevalent in the United States than other countries? And can you elaborate as to why or why not?
These are such great questions. Oh my gosh. I love your young people. These are great questions.
I know, living hope, right?
Goodness. Yes. You guys, you're the hope of the world. You're asking great questions. Okay. The first question was, is the South the most prominent place of where you find racism in America? And I would say no. And it never has been, but it certainly isn't today. And largely because of history. First of all, when you look back in the history of enslavement and genocide in America, it literally happened everywhere. It started actually in New England. Slavery, the funding for the slave trade was in Rhode Island. Rhode Island funded the slave trade, and then later New York City. People in the north, in New England area also owned slaves. They didn't have major plantations, but most households had at least like one slave. Philadelphia, New Jersey. Now they ultimately in the North by, I think it was 1804 or in the early 1800s is when they outlawed slavery in the North. Maybe it was 1830 something. I need to go back and take a look at that. So, but the North eventually outlawed slavery. And so that then relegated enslavement to the South. But still New York City was the main funder. And at that time, at the time that slavery was in the South, the genocide of the Northeast was moving west with the invention of the railroad and the transatlantic railroad, the taking in, the bringing of Chinese into America just to build the railroad and not allowing women to come. This is a national institution. White supremacy is a national institution, and it is the institution that built this country. We would not be the most powerful nation in the world if it was not for the exploitation of land and people and the stealing of land and people. So is the South the most racist place in the nation? No, it really isn't. And also, get this, after the Civil War, you had about 11 years of like bliss among people of African descent. Maybe not bliss, but it was close to it. It was incredible growth. It was actually like 2,000 people of African descent became legislators. They ran for and won public office in the 11 years right after the Civil War. Can you imagine that? Formerly enslaved people became senators and House members and lieutenant governors and judges all over the South because now they're the majority. So they're voting their people in. And that's when the KKK rose up. And that's when the Harding Compromise happened, or the compromise rather of 1877. And that's when the federal troops were pulled out of the South. And that's when the pogrom really happened against the people of African descent in the South. And that's when the Great Migration began. In 1877, all the way to 1970, for about 100 years, you had a flood of people of African descent running for their lives, really, from the South to the North and to the West, trying to escape the terror of the Ku Klux Klan and the white citizens' councils that came up after them. The lynchings, the peonage that put people back onto the same plantations they were just freed from, because they lowered the bar of criminality, made sitting on a park bench for too long a criminal offense that someone could be then thrown into jail with. And guess what that jail was? It was the plantation they were just freed from, because the 13th Amendment gave that loophole. So not only, and this is my point, not only did Black people flee north and west, but white people also migrated north and west, specifically to the Midwest, to where you are right now, to Kansas, to Oklahoma, to Missouri, to the upper Midwest in that time, because of the monocropping in the South created drought and created deep poverty in the South. And so in order to get any kind of hope for living, folks moved from the South. White people who had been entrenched for centuries in white hierarchy, in white supremacist hierarchy, moved their bodies and their politics and their mindsets from the South into the Midwest. So when you ask now, today, is the South the most racist place? All you really need to do is ask yourself, which states are creating, are enacting voter suppression right now, are trying to pass voter suppression bills in their state legislators. 43 out of 50 states. There's only 7 states in the entire union that are not trying to pass voter suppression right now. So is the South most racist? No. It just has the longest history of it, but it's everywhere. And the second question, can you repeat the second question?
Would you say that racism is more prevalent in the United States than other
Yeah.
countries? And can you elaborate as to why or why not?
So good. Okay. So I love this question too. I have been all over the world. In the last decade, I've traveled to South Africa, to Brazil, to Australia, to Germany, and to Ireland, in particular, those major places. And in all of those places, you actually see either the colonized or the colonizer, right? So in Germany, you see the colonizer. In Ireland, you see the colonized and the colonizer. In Australia, you see the colonized when you go to the Aboriginal people, and when you talk with the white people, you actually also see the colonized. You see white people who were imprisoned on the land of Australia. So that has a really interesting bent. But what I've learned, wherever I've gone, the same MO, the same modus operandi was put into place because the same people were doing it. The land was stolen by racializing the people. Race looks different in different colonies, excuse me. Race looks different in different colonial areas. So race looks very different in Brazil than it does in apartheid South Africa. Race looks very different in America than it does in Australia. But get this, in all of those, they have categories called Black. And in all of those, Black is at the bottom. And while Brazil might have literally like hundreds of racial categories, because nobody really wants to be Black, so they'll figure out somewhere to be not Black, not quite Black, like literally mocha, but not Black. The truth is still the same, that history of enslavement, which was a global enterprise, exacted by the same people of European descent, is global. And so as a result, when those people went around the world and enslaved and colonized the land, you have the same mechanisms that are at work everywhere. So when George Floyd died last year, and America saw 123 cities burning at one night, on one of those nights in the first week, the next week saw protests around the world, anti-white supremacist protests in Brazil, in Australia, in South Africa, in Ireland, everywhere where there was colonization, there were also anti-white supremacist protests calling for the first time in like, how many, 700 years, 600 years? 600 years. For the first time, equality, the recognition of the humanity, the call, and the capacity of all humans to exercise dominion on land. And let me just say this last piece to you, that wherever there was colonization, there had to be white supremacy, because colonization, by its definition, believes that the colonizer is the only one called by God to rule on that land. So we are still in America today. We are in a decolonizing moment. So race is really only a tool of colonization. It's a way to divide and conquer.
Thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
Before we move into our Q&A from our attendees, I have one last question, and it's actually my question.
Okay.
So one of my favorite activists and faith leaders, Valerie Kaur,
Oh, yes.
oftentimes will say the way we make change is just as important as the change we make.
Yes.
For those of us that lead in predominantly white ministries and churches, what are some of the ways you suggest we reimagine, rethink our faith formation and our Christian education departments as we work to decolonize the church?
Wow, that's a great question too. Oh my goodness. And you're not even 14 years old. How did you come up with that? That was really great. Wow. It's a big question. I think that okay, so I'm going to step to a 30,000 foot level with this question. And I want to ask you to go there with me. When we ask the question of how do we get where we are? How did Christian education get where it is? How do we even determine what Christianity is? How do we know this? Who gives us our frameworks for who is this person named Jesus and what he said, what he meant by what he said?
Mm-hmm.
Since the time of Constantine, the answer has been people of European descent have defined a non-European religion. Think about that. I'm pushing you. I know I'm pushing you. I know some people are really mad at me right now, but I'm okay. I'm okay with that. This is fact. Even the Nicene Creed. Oh, I love the Nicene Creed. I don't disagree with the Nicene Creed. But even the Nicene Creed was called by Constantine. He called together religious leaders of the time and said, y'all figure out what you believe, and then I decide if it actually is going to stick. So what happens? What happens then? Well, then they jerry-rig what they believe in order for it to be passed by Constantine, right? So from the time of Constantine, our framework for what it means to be a follower of Jesus has been formed by the halls of empire. Now think about this on another side of it. Jesus was a colonized, brown, indigenous man. He was a man with thousands of years of history on that same land. He was a brown man. He was a man whose people actually identified more with the continent of Africa. Actually, not even more. They identified with the continent of Africa, not of Europe. They did not. I took a trip to Israel a few years back. I think 2018, I was there. And I asked a Palestinian man who I was in conversation with, because I was at a conference called Christ at the Checkpoint in Bethlehem. And it was run by Palestinian Christians. And so I was talking with a Palestinian man, and I asked him, so what is your relationship to Africa? Like, how do you feel about Africa? And he looked at me really weird. He literally looked at me like, what? And I said it again. And he said, we are Africa. We are Africa. Like literally. And it's really actually true. The only reason for any kind of a land break is because of a man-made canal called the Suez Canal that was created by white people. It was created by Europe in the 20th century, right? So you're not, or the turn of the century, our view Our view of the scripture has been skewed by our unconscious bias, our unconscious white supremacy. So we go to Sunday school and we see pictures of Jesus that are white. We go to church and we see Jesus standing at the altar with his white hands outstretched and his blonde hair and blue eyes. We go to conferences and every person on the platform is white. And we think God is white. And we think Christianity. And so, of course, like Malcolm X would say Christianity is a white man's religion, but he was wrong. Jesus was a brown revolutionary against colonizing Europe, against Rome, who had occupied his territory, who had crucified 2,000 northern Galileans the year that he was born, the area that he was born in, the year that he was born. 2,000 people were hung on crosses and lined the roads because they attempted to rise up against Caesar. That's the context of our faith. And when you go back and you look at every single person who wrote every single book of the Bible, they were all either colonized or, in two cases, they were not colonized, but they were under threat of it. They were fearing it, and that's David and Solomon. They were kings of this dinky little kingdom called Israel that kept getting sacked. So how we read the scripture is deeply impacted by who we are reading it with and who gets to frame, who gets to see things in it and draw it forth. So I posit to you that if the work of the Reformation was to decenter Rome from the church and to move from the center the Catholic Church and to actually it was actually a democratic project. It was giving the ability for people, individuals, to have direct access to God. If that was the work of the Reformation, then I believe the next 500 years, the work is going to be to decolonize our faith, to decolonize the way we see the scripture, to decolonize the way that we see Jesus and Paul and Adam and Ish and Isha and Abraham and Sarai. It's going to be, we have to decolonize the way that we see Peter, the way that we see every single, and then that is going to change what we see in the text. It has to, because friends, the ones who created our faith, your Presbyterian church, your faith finds its roots back in Scotland. The ones who created our faith, who built our Christian faiths, our denominations, they were not God. They were flawed human beings. And they were answering questions that were relevant questions in their context and their time. So the Presbyterian Church grew up as an answer to Catholicism, as an answer to other pieces, other movements that were going on in the land at the time. It's not Jesus. It's not even scripture. We have to get back to Jesus. Brown, colonized Jesus, to be reintroduced to our own faith. Until we do that, we will be in a religion that tolerated slavery for 300 years, 250 something years. We will be in a religion that did not cause the nations from which it sprang to call for abolition. So when our religion does not call for the abolishment of slavery or the end of colonization, that's a problem when our Jesus was colonized.
Thank you for that. That's a lot to reflect on, and I am so grateful to wrestle with that. And I hope to have an evolved ministry here at Village Church specifically. We're going to take one question from the audience so we can honor time, if you're open to that, Lisa.
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. So our question is still pertaining to youth. For students of philosophy in secondary schools and universities, is there an implicit bias being taught?
For students of philosophy in secondary schools and universities, the answer is yes. Absolutely. Something I learned in the last several years that struck me, I'm not the expert in this, but I was on a panel with someone who is, so I learned this, that the institutions that grew up in the 20th century, particularly, really the mainline church that got established, the university system, universities, and all these institutions that grew up, particularly in urban centers, they grew up in order to create stability in a changing world. They grew up in order to entrench the status quo. So that's why when you go to these universities, you're taught a curriculum. And that's not a bad thing. Curriculums are not bad. You have to have a curriculum. You have to know what you're going to be teaching, right? But understand the era that these universities were created within was a white supremacist era. It was a time when eugenics was actually pretty much the law in at least half of the nation. And if it wasn't eugenics, then it was white supremacy light at Yale and Harvard, right? And Columbia. So the question that people are within the academy, the struggle continues to be, it's when all you have to do is talk to educators within the academy, especially educators of color and women in particular, women of color in the academy. If you come with another worldview that challenges the worldview of the white men that established the curriculum, then you are either called not orthodox, and so therefore pushed out, especially in Christian education spaces, or you are not even tenured. You're not given a platform. Your platform can be taken away from you at any minute if you say the wrong thing. And the wrong thing is the thing that challenges the established status quo. So there is a movement, an absolute movement within academic spaces, and those movements are actually carving out spaces for free thought. Usually, though, in the 1980s and 70s, they were hidden in areas of the university that were kind of pigeonholed: women's studies, African American studies, Chicano studies, rather than history, right? The history classes were all taught by the white men. The sociology classes were all taught by the white men. But if you want to learn a point of view that comes from a non-white point of view, you have to go into these pigeonholed areas. That's beginning to change, but it's slow.